He carved nightmares into reality, long before Hollywood ever put them on a screen. What twisted force could transform an isolated farm boy into the blueprint for some of the most iconic horror villains in history? What secret festered behind those peeling walls, growing darker than anyone dared imagine? Stay with this story, and you will uncover the chilling path that turned Ed Gein into horror's most disturbing inspiration. Ed Gein's story begins in the desolate farmlands of rural Wisconsin, where silence was not merely the absence of noise, but a way of life. Long before his name became shorthand for terror, he was just a quiet child living under the crushing weight of a household ruled by one person, his mother, Augusta. Her grip was absolute, forged through relentless sermons about sin, corruption, and the evil she claimed lurked in every corner of the outside world. For young Ed, the walls of their isolated farmhouse were meant to protect him from a wicked society. In truth, those same walls were sealing him inside a world that would slowly distort his mind. Augusta saw immorality everywhere except within herself, and she wielded her beliefs with iron severity. She isolated Ed and his older brother, Henry, refusing to let them form friendships or experience anything beyond their strict, joyless routines. Every day revolved around work on the farm and long, punishing lectures about the dangers of women, the decay of humanity, and the sanctity of obedience. To Augusta, the world was a cesspool, and only she possessed the truth. For Ed, who adored her with a devotion bordering on worship, her voice became the only compass he trusted. But even in that bleak environment, the brothers were not identical. Henry questioned their mother's authority, recognizing the toxicity of her worldview. Ed, however, clung to Augusta's every word. This growing divide would shape the trajectory of the entire family. As the boys grew older, Henry's subtle defiance grated against Ed's unwavering loyalty. Their arguments often ended with Ed retreating to silence, while Henry shook his head at the suffocating fanaticism controlling their home. Tragedy struck when their father died after years of illness and alcoholism, leaving the family fractured but still bound under Augusta's domineering rule. The brothers took on more responsibilities, and tensions between them deepened. Henry grew increasingly vocal about his concerns regarding Ed's dependency on their mother. He confided in neighbors, suggesting Augusta's influence was unnatural. These doubts, spoken quietly but clearly, created a dangerous rift. Then came the fire. A large blaze broke out in a marshy area near their property during a routine brush burning. Henry and Ed worked to contain it, but as night fell and the smoke thickened, the brothers became separated. According to Ed, he lost sight of Henry in the chaos and sought help from the local sheriff. When authorities followed Ed back to the scene, they found Henry's lifeless body lying face down. Though his death was officially attributed to asphyxiation, the circumstances raised uneasy questions. There were no burns on his body, and his position did not match someone overcome by smoke. Some believed the fire was only part of the story. Others suspected Ed's devotion to Augusta might have taken a darker turn. Henry's death left Ed alone with the one person who had shaped every thought he had ever formed. The household grew even quieter, its isolation more intense. Ed took over more chores and responsibilities, maintaining the farm and caring for Augusta as her health deteriorated. For him, she was still the moral authority of the universe. For her, he was the last barrier protecting her from the wickedness she believed awaited outside. But fate would not spare Ed from heartbreak. Augusta suffered a series of strokes that stripped away her strength and fueled her bitterness. Ed nursed her obsessively, tending to her every need, but it was never enough to soothe her rage toward the world. Her death became the final fracture, the blow that shattered whatever fragile balance existed in Ed's mind. The woman who had defined his reality was gone, and with her passing, the farm fell into absolute silence. Ed's loneliness deepened into something far more dangerous, a void where grief, obsession, and mental decay began to merge. And soon, That void would demand to be filled. Before we step into the darkness that followed, hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And tell me, do you believe Henry's death was truly an accident? Or was it the first sign of something far more disturbing? After Augusta's death, the Gein farmhouse became a monument to decay, both physical and psychological. Rooms once ruled by her presence were sealed off by Ed as if they were sacred relics. He locked away her bedroom, her parlor, and the sitting room, preserving every object exactly as she had left it. Dust gathered over untouched furniture, sunlight faded behind heavy curtains, and silence took on a suffocating weight. Ed lived almost entirely within a few small spaces: the kitchen, a makeshift sleeping corner, and the cold, cluttered utility rooms. Everything else became a shrine to the only person he ever loved. With no family, no friends, and no guidance beyond the echoes of his mother's teachings, Ed's world shrank even further. Isolation became a prison he did not recognize as such. His grief festered into obsession, and his mind, already shaped by years of emotional distortion, began to fracture. He spent his days doing odd jobs around the community, repairs for neighbors, small tasks at local farms. People found him strange but harmless, a shy, awkward man with a soft voice and nervous laugh. Beneath that timid exterior, however, something monstrous was taking form. Ed's nights were different. Alone in the silent farmhouse, he surrounded himself with books about anatomy, grave robbing, headhunters, and cult rituals. He was fascinated by tales of skin masks, mummified remains, and the idea of creating vessels to bring the dead closer to the living. These obsessions seeped into the emptiness left behind by Augusta's absence. His loneliness, mixed with delusions and untreated mental instability, pushed him toward a path no one in the quiet town of Plainfield could have imagined. But isolation does not happen in a vacuum. It twists and compounds until it demands release. For Ed, that release took the form of nightly excursions to the local cemetery. Under the cover of darkness, he dug into freshly buried graves, driven by a compulsive need to retrieve the remains of women who resembled his mother. He would later claim he entered a daze, barely conscious of his actions, as if guided by some invisible force pulling him toward the dead. Whether he truly believed this or simply sought refuge from responsibility remains debated. What is certain is that these grave robberies became the foundation for his most disturbing creations. Inside the farmhouse, Ed began assembling objects crafted from human remains. Chairs upholstered with human skin, bowls made from skull caps, masks fashioned from the faces of deceased women. Each grisly artifact was part of a grotesque attempt to reconstruct the presence he had lost. His delusions grew stronger. He convinced himself he could become his mother, or at least inhabit her spirit, by wearing the skin of women who resembled her. The boundary between identity and obsession dissolved entirely. Still, these horrors remained hidden behind the peeling walls of the farmhouse. To the outside world, Ed was peculiar but reliable. He shopped at the local grocery store, cracked awkward jokes, and helped neighbors with minor repairs. People dismissed his oddities as harmless quirks. No one suspected the magnitude of the darkness brooding on his farm. But that illusion of normalcy would not last forever. Everything began to spiral on the day Mary Hogan disappeared. She was a tavern owner, spirited and outspoken, a stark contrast to Plainfield's quiet atmosphere. Her tavern became empty one winter morning, and investigators found only a pool of blood on the floor. Locals were shocked, unable to fathom who would harm her. When Ed joked awkwardly days later that Mary was hanging out at his place, people laughed uneasily, assuming it was just another one of his strange remarks. No one imagined he was telling the literal truth. The disappearance of Mary Hogan marked a turning point. It was the moment when Ed's fantasies breached the fragile barrier that separated grave robber from killer. His need for control, his delusions of resurrecting or embodying his mother, and his growing detachment from reality had merged into something unstoppable. And soon, a second disappearance would propel everything into the light, exposing horrors far beyond anyone's darkest imagination. The question was no longer if Ed would be discovered, but when. The disappearance of Mary Hogan lingered in Plainfield like a cold draft no one could locate, unsettling but invisible. Months passed, and although rumors circulated, the quiet town returned to its routines. Ed continued drifting through his days as though nothing had changed, performing small chores, visiting the hardware store, and maintaining the same soft-spoken demeanor that made people dismiss him as merely eccentric. But inside the farmhouse, his obsessions escalated. The grotesque artifacts he crafted became more elaborate, each one a twisted homage to the woman whose absence still tormented him. Every object was a substitute for the presence he felt slipping away, a desperate attempt to rewrite the unbearable void Augusta had left behind. As the years moved toward the cold autumn of 1957, Ed's psychological unraveling deepened. His delusions became more vivid. He believed the dead could speak to him. He felt drawn to voices that echoed in his mind, urging him to reconstruct the warmth he had lost, to resurrect a sense of belonging through ritual and transformation. He clung to these fantasies with a sincerity that made them indistinguishable from reality. Neighbors who noticed his growing isolation assumed it was simply grief or poverty, never imagining the true nature of the horrors concealed behind his locked doors. Then came the morning of Bernice Worden's disappearance. Bernice, the respected and stern owner of the local hardware store, was known for her discipline and straightforward manner. She opened her shop early on a frigid November day, as she always did. Hours later, her son Frank returned from a hunting trip to find the shop abandoned and streaked with blood. The cash register was missing, and the last receipt written that morning bore one name: Ed Gein. Authorities moved quickly, driven by urgency and the grim echoes of Mary Hogan's unresolved case. They located Ed at the home of a neighbor where he had gone for dinner. He seemed calm, almost serene, as officers approached him. When questioned about Bernice, he replied with vague remarks, neither denying nor admitting anything directly. His eyes carried a distant, hollow quality, as though he were only partially connected to the world around him. Officers arrested him on suspicion, but none were prepared for what they were about to uncover. While Ed was taken into custody, a team of deputies approached the Gein farmhouse. The night was bitterly cold, and the building loomed like a dark silhouette against the frozen fields. The front door was locked, forcing the deputies to approach the side entrance. Pushing it open with caution, they stepped into a darkness thick enough to feel. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, but what the light revealed was beyond comprehension. The deputies froze. Hanging from the rafters was the body of Bernice Worden, mutilated in a manner more horrifying than anything they had seen, even in wartime. Her remains were treated not as a victim of violence, but as a grotesque object of ritual. The room was cold, silent, and suffocating. And this discovery was only the beginning. As the officers moved deeper into the house, their shock transformed into disbelief. The farmhouse was not a home, but a macabre workshop filled with human remains crafted into household items. Mask-like faces stared from shadows. Furniture was upholstered with human skin. Skulls served as bowls, and bones were stacked as though awaiting some ritualistic purpose. The deputies retreated in waves of revulsion and fear. Each step into the next room revealed another layer of Ed's delusion, each discovery more grotesque than the last. The investigation rapidly escalated into a nightmare unraveling in real time. The details spread across the sheriff's department like a fever, leaving even seasoned officers pale and shaken. Plainfield, the quiet farming town, had become the epicenter of one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. But while the farmhouse exposed the unimaginable, the question that haunted investigators was even darker. How long had Ed lived like this? And how much more remained hidden in the depths of his fractured mind? What they would uncover next would challenge every expectation and reveal the true scale of his descent. As investigators processed the nightmare inside the Gein farmhouse, the magnitude of what they had found began to settle in like a suffocating fog. Seasoned officers who had handled violent crimes and gruesome accidents stood speechless, shaken to their core. Yet, for all the horrors displayed openly in the cluttered rooms, what disturbed them most was the eerie sense of intention behind everything. Nothing appeared chaotic. Every object, every artifact, seemed carefully crafted, arranged with purpose, as though Ed had been building a world disconnected from reality and bound only to his delusions. While deputies cataloged human remains fashioned into everyday items, forensic teams attempted to understand the timeline of Ed's actions. They discovered that most of the bones and skin belonged not to murder victims, but to women exhumed from local cemeteries, women whose faces and features resembled Augusta. Each exhumation was deliberate, carried out within days of burial, suggesting a level of planning that contradicted Ed's timid public facade. Yet there was no denying that Ed's psychological state had deteriorated far beyond comprehension. At the sheriff's department, Ed sat calmly in an interrogation room, his demeanor almost childlike. He answered questions with a soft, steady tone, speaking about his actions as casually as one might recount chores or daily errands. He admitted to grave robbing with a matter-of-fact simplicity that left detectives stunned. When asked about Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, he drifted into vague descriptions that blurred fantasy and reality. He referred to his crimes not as acts of violence, but as tasks he felt compelled to perform, driven by forces he believed he could not resist. Psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate him, and their findings revealed a deeply fractured mind. Ed exhibited signs of severe mental illness, including psychosis, delusions, and a distorted sense of identity. He confessed that after Augusta's death, he felt utterly alone, as though the one anchor in his life had been ripped away. His solution was to recreate her presence, literally by crafting a woman's suit from the skin of corpses. He claimed he wore it as a way to feel close to her, to become her, to bridge the unbearable emptiness that consumed him. This revelation stunned both the public and the psychiatric community, highlighting the unprecedented nature of his delusions. As word spread, Plainfield transformed almost overnight. Reporters, investigators, and curious onlookers flooded the area, turning the once quiet town into a chaotic spectacle. Neighbors who had known Ed for years grappled with the impossible truth. They remembered him as a gentle, awkward handyman who never raised his voice. Now they struggled to reconcile that image with the monstrous reality uncovered in his home. Some refused to believe it, convinced that Ed must have been framed or manipulated. Others simply fell silent, unable to process the betrayal of their own assumptions. While the investigation unfolded, experts continued analyzing the items taken from the farmhouse. Each artifact told its own story, revealing patterns in Ed's behavior that pointed to a singular obsession: his mother. Psychiatrists concluded that Augusta's dominance had shaped every aspect of Ed's psyche. Her rigid worldview, her condemnation of women, and her emotional isolation molded him into a man incapable of forming healthy relationships or coping with loss. Her death created a void that Ed attempted to fill through increasingly extreme measures, ultimately blurring the line between mourning and madness. The legal system now faced the daunting task of determining whether Ed was fit to stand trial. His psychological condition raised immediate concerns. Doctors argued that he was profoundly mentally ill, suffering from delusions so severe that he could not fully comprehend the nature of his actions. Prosecutors, on the other hand, needed to prove both criminal responsibility and intent, despite the overwhelming evidence of his deteriorated mental state. A psychiatric evaluation concluded that Ed was legally insane at the time of the murders. The court ruled that he would not stand trial. instead committing him to a secure mental institution where he would remain under constant supervision. The public reacted with mixed emotions: outrage, confusion, and a lingering sense that justice had somehow slipped through their fingers. But even as Ed was removed from society, the impact of his crimes was only beginning to unfold. Filmmakers, authors, and journalists descended upon the case, drawn by the unprecedented blend of horror and psychological complexity. Ed's story would soon inspire some of the most iconic and unsettling characters in cinema history figures that would define the horror genre for generations. But before those shadows took shape on the silver screen, the world still wanted answers. How had an unassuming farmhand become the blueprint for terror itself? As Ed Gein settled into the harsh routines of the Central State Hospital, the world outside began reshaping his legacy into something far larger and far darker than the crimes themselves. What investigators had uncovered in his farmhouse was so unprecedented, so grotesquely symbolic, that storytellers from every corner of American culture felt compelled to reinterpret it. Ed had become a morbid blueprint, a living myth whose shadow extended far beyond Plainfield. Yet inside the institution, he remained oddly content, spending his days reading, doing simple chores, and speaking with staff in the same soft, polite tone that had once convinced neighbors he was harmless. Meanwhile, journalists dissected every known detail of his past. They analyzed his childhood, the suffocating grip of Augusta, the psychological collapse that followed her death, and the chilling artifacts found in his home. The story offered everything: tragedy, mystery, madness, and horror. It became impossible for the public to look away. Ed's crimes were not simply violent. They were symbolic, ritualistic, and deeply rooted in his obsession with identity and loss. This combination made his case irresistible to writers and filmmakers seeking narratives that pushed the boundaries of fear. The first major work inspired by Ed's life emerged in the early 1960s, the novel Psycho by Robert Bloch. Bloch lived barely an hour from Plainfield and had followed the case closely. Though he altered the setting and characters, the core inspiration was unmistakable. Norman Bates, the shy, awkward motel owner, dominated by his overbearing mother, held a chilling resemblance to Ed Bates' fractured psyche, and desperate attempts to keep his mother alive through delusion mirrored the psychological blueprint investigators had documented. When Alfred Hitchcock adapted the novel into a film, the horror genre changed forever. Norman Bates became an icon, but behind him stood the shadow of Ed Gein. Yet Psycho was only the beginning. A decade later, another film would draw from the grotesque imagery of Ed's farmhouse. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre presented a cannibalistic family led by Leatherface, a hulking figure who wore human skin masks eerily similar to those confiscated from Ed's home. The film's raw intensity and unsettling realism terrified audiences, pushing horror into a new, visceral direction. Leatherface's mask was not a random creative choice. It was a direct echo of Ed's attempt to craft a second skin, a new identity stitched from the dead. Then came The Silence of the Lambs, featuring Buffalo Bill, another character shaped partly by Ed's legacy. Bill's obsession with transformation and his desire to create a woman's suit from skin reflected Ed's delusional belief that wearing such a suit could bring him closer to his mother. Although the film's narrative blended elements from multiple real killers, a foundation of Bill's psychological obsession traced back unmistakably to the farmhouse in Plainfield. Through these stories, Ed's influence spread worldwide, turning him into a cultural archetype, the quiet outsider harboring unspeakable horrors behind closed doors. Ironically, Ed himself remained unaware of the magnitude of his influence. He lived out his days in the mental institution peacefully, gardening, reading magazines, and engaging in simple conversations. Staff members often described him as gentle and compliant, a man who appeared grateful for structure and supervision. But beneath that calm exterior lay the chilling truth. Ed had irrevocably altered the fabric of American horror. As the years passed, his myth only grew stronger. People debated whether his crimes were the result of mental illness, maternal domination, or something far darker that no diagnosis could explain. Filmmakers continued mining his story, shaping it into countless adaptations, reinterpretations, and symbolic nightmares. Ed Gein had become something more than a criminal. He was a mirror reflecting society's deepest fears. But his legacy was not finished. One final chapter remained, one that would explore the end of his life, the destruction of his infamous farmhouse, and the unresolved questions that still haunt his story today. And those final moments would reveal just how deeply Ed Gein's shadow remained etched into American memory. Before we unravel the final chapter, hit subscribe so you never miss stories like this. And tell me, which horror character inspired by Ed Gein do you think is the most disturbing? In the years that followed his confinement, Ed Gein's life settled into a strange, almost serene rhythm behind the walls of the Central State Hospital. He became a model patient, participating in simple tasks, gardening, and reading pulp magazines as though he were living a quiet retirement rather than serving a life sentence for crimes that had shocked the nation. Staff members described him as polite, obedient, and oddly cheerful. This contrast between the monstrous legacy outside and the meek, aging man inside only deepened the mystery of who Ed truly was. Was he a product of severe mental illness, a victim of devastating trauma, or a calculating figure whose calm demeanor masked something darker? The debate never faded. Outside the institution, however, the world was far from calm. The Gein farmhouse, the epicenter of the horrors discovered in 1957, had become a morbid attraction. Thrill seekers, journalists, and curiosity-driven travelers flocked to Plainfield, desperate to glimpse the structure where nightmares had been carved into reality. Local authorities grew increasingly frustrated, aware that the house had become a grotesque landmark. They feared it would one day reopen old wounds in a community still trying to recover from the shock. Their fears proved right. In 1958, only months after Ed was committed, the farmhouse mysteriously burned to the ground. Flames engulfed the structure in the dead of night, reducing it to ashes by dawn. Firefighters responded quickly, but the blaze moved too fast for meaningful intervention. Some suspected arson, believing someone in the community wanted to erase the physical reminder of the horrors committed there. Others saw it as symbolic, an almost poetic end to the place that had harbored so much darkness. Ed's reaction to the news was disturbingly indifferent. When staff informed him that the house had burned, he simply replied that it is better this way, a statement that raised more questions than it answered. The destruction of the farmhouse did little to quiet public obsession. Auctions of Ed's belongings sparked controversy, particularly the attempted sale of his old pickup truck. A carnival sideshow operator purchased the truck with the intention of using it as an attraction, sparking outrage among locals who saw it as exploitation of tragedy. Authorities eventually intervened, and most remnants of Ed's former life were either destroyed or locked away in evidence storage. Still, the myth only grew. Books, films, academic studies, and endless speculation kept Ed's name alive, ensuring that his influence far outlived him. Inside the hospital, Ed aged into a frail, white-haired man. His once obsessive mind appeared subdued, softened either by treatment, routine, or the passing of time. Yet staff who worked closely with him noted that he never expressed genuine remorse or a clear understanding of the magnitude of his actions. He spoke of his crimes as though they belonged to another lifetime, as though they were foggy memories rather than deliberate acts. This detachment left professionals puzzled. Was it genuine mental deterioration, a defense mechanism, or a sign that Ed had always lived in a reality disconnected from the world around him? Ed Gein died in 1984 from complications of respiratory failure, bringing an end to one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. But death did not free him from fascination. His grave, located beside those of his family, became a target for vandals and trophy seekers. Over time, his headstone was repeatedly defaced, stolen, and eventually removed entirely to prevent further disturbances. Even in death, Ed remained a symbol that society could not fully contain or comprehend. What makes Ed Gein's story endure is not merely the horror of his actions, but the psychological labyrinth behind them. He was not a typical serial killer driven by cruelty or predation. He was something far more complex and unsettling, a man whose fractured mind blurred the boundaries between grief, obsession, identity, and delusion. His crimes forced the world to confront uncomfortable questions about the human psyche, the impact of abuse and isolation, and the chilling truth that monstrosity can emerge not only from malice, but from madness left untreated. And through every retelling, whether in films, books, or whispered legends, Ed's influence continues to shape the landscape of horror, not because people celebrate him, but because his story reveals something primal, that the most terrifying monsters are not always the ones lurking in the dark, but sometimes the ones quietly walking among us, hidden behind soft voices, polite smiles, and lonely lives. In the ashes of that farmhouse, in the silence of his final years, and in every character he inspired, Ed Gein's legacy endures a haunting reminder of how thin the line can be between ordinary and unimaginable.